The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Whitmore mansion, like accusations against glass, each drop carrying the weight of secrets that had festered in these halls for decades. Maria Santos pressed her weathered hands against the marble countertop, watching the storm rage outside while the grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 11 times. She had been cleaning this house for 8 years, invisible to its owners, a ghost who dusted their shame and mopped their guilt without ever speaking of what she witnessed in the shadows. Tonight felt different. The air itself seemed charged with more than just electricity from the storm. If you've ever felt that moment when everything you thought you knew was about to shatter, then you understand the tremor in Maria's chest as she heard the front door's heavy lock turn with a click that echoed through the empty mansion like a gunshot. The Whitmores were supposed to be in the Hamptons for another week. Richard Whitmore, the pharmaceutical magnate whose company had made billions from medications that kept the poor sick and the rich healthy, never returned early from his retreats. His wife, Eleanor, a woman whose charity galas were more about tax write-offs than genuine compassion, followed his schedule like a shadow follows its master. Their son Bradley, 25 and already corrupted by inherited wealth, was supposed to be networking at some exclusive resort where handshakes were worth more than most people's annual salaries. Maria's pulse quickened as footsteps echoed across the Italian marble. But these weren't the familiar sounds of the Whitmore family. These steps carried purpose, weight, and something else she couldn't quite identify. She peered around the kitchen doorway, her breath catching in her throat as she saw him. A tall black man in an expensive charcoal suit moved through the foyer with the confidence of someone who belonged there, yet Maria had never seen him before. His presence commanded the space in a way that made the mansion's opulent decorations seem suddenly small and insignificant. He carried himself like royalty, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of battles fought and won, of struggles that money couldn't erase. What struck Maria most wasn't his obvious wealth or commanding presence, but the way he paused before the portrait of Richard Whitmore that dominated the main staircase. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment the mask of composure slipped to reveal something raw and painful underneath. The stranger reached into his jacket and pulled out a key, the same ornate brass key that Maria had seen Richard use countless times. But how could this man possibly have access to the Whitmore family's most private spaces? Her mind raced through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. He moved with purpose toward Richard's study, the one room Maria was strictly forbidden from entering. She had always wondered what secrets lay behind that mahogany door, what documents and conversations were too dangerous for even the help to witness. Now, watching this mysterious figure unlock the door with practiced ease, she felt the weight of 8 years of questions pressing against her chest like stones. Maria knew she should retreat to her quarters, pretend she had seen nothing, continue living in the comfortable blindness that had kept her employed and her family fed. But something deeper than curiosity pulled her forward. Perhaps it was the way this man had looked at Richard's portrait, with a mixture of pain and determination that reminded her of her own father's expression when he spoke of injustices that could never be made right. She crept closer, her soft-soled shoes silent against the marble, until she could see through the crack in the study door that the stranger had left slightly ajar. What she witnessed in that moment would haunt her dreams and change the trajectory of her life forever. The man stood before Richard's massive desk, but he wasn't stealing anything. Instead, he was carefully placing documents on the leather surface, photographs that even from her limited vantage point made Maria's stomach turn. Images of children, emaciated and dying, their eyes hollow with a suffering that spoke of systematic neglect. Medical reports with Richard's signature authorizing the withholding of life-saving medications from entire communities. Financial records showing how Whitmore Pharmaceuticals had deliberately created drug shortages in poor neighborhoods while stockpiling supplies for wealthy clients. But it was the next set of documents that made Maria's knees weak. birth certificates, adoption papers, and a DNA test result that bore two names, Richard Whitmore and Marcus Whitmore Johnson. The man in the study wasn't a stranger at all. He was Richard's son, the child that Richard had abandoned 35 years ago when an affair with a black woman threatened to destroy his carefully constructed image of respectability. Marcus moved with the precision of someone who had planned this moment for years. He photographed each document with a professional camera, his hands steady despite the emotional earthquake that must have been raging inside him. Maria watched as he opened Richard's safe, using a combination that he somehow knew by heart, and removed more evidence of his father's crimes against humanity. The storm outside intensified, as if nature itself was responding to the revelations unfolding within these walls. Lightning illuminated Marcus's face as he worked, and Maria saw in his features an unmistakable resemblance to the man whose portrait dominated the foyer. The same strong jawline, the same intelligent eyes, but where Richard's face had grown soft with privilege and cruelty, Marcus's bore the sharp edges of someone who had fought for every success. What would you do if you discovered that your employer, the person who had fed your family for nearly a decade, was responsible for the deaths of thousands of innocent people? Maria felt the weight of this knowledge settling into her bones like lead, understanding that her comfortable ignorance had just been shattered forever. Marcus pulled out a laptop and began uploading the photographs to what appeared to be a secure server. His movements were methodical, professional, and Maria realized that this wasn't just personal revenge. This was justice being served by someone who had the resources and determination to see it through. As she watched, Marcus opened a leather journal and began writing. Even from her hidden position, Maria could see that his handwriting was elegant, educated, nothing like the crude scrawl she might have expected from someone seeking simple vengeance. He was documenting everything, creating a record that would be impossible to dispute or dismiss. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, and Marcus looked up from his work. For a terrifying moment, Maria thought he had sensed her presence, but his gaze was fixed on something beyond the study walls, perhaps on memories of a childhood spent wondering why his father had never acknowledged his existence. Maria's own childhood had been marked by similar abandonment, though hers came from poverty rather than shame. She understood the hollow ache of being invisible, of serving people who looked through you as if you were nothing more than furniture with hands. But watching Marcus work with such focused determination, she began to understand that invisibility could also be a form of power. The documents Marcus was collecting painted a picture of systematic evil that went far beyond simple corporate greed. Whitmore Pharmaceuticals hadn't just overcharged for medications. They had actively prevented life-saving drugs from reaching communities of color, creating artificial shortages that resulted in preventable deaths. The company had conducted illegal medical experiments on prisoners and immigrants, using their desperation as leverage for consent that wasn't truly given. But perhaps most damning of all were the communications between Richard and government officials, showing how bribes and political contributions had been used to suppress investigations and silence whistleblowers. Maria recognized some of the names from news reports about activists and journalists who had died under mysterious circumstances while investigating pharmaceutical companies. As Marcus continued his work, Maria noticed something that made her heart race with a different kind of fear. He wasn't just collecting evidence, he was also planting something. Small devices, no larger than buttons, were being carefully placed throughout the study. Recording equipment, she realized, designed to capture whatever conversations took place in this room when the Whitmores returned. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't just seeking justice for past crimes, he was setting a trap for future ones. And when that trap was sprung, everyone in this house would be caught in the explosion, including her. Maria's mind raced through her options. She could retreat to her room, pack her belongings, and disappear before the Whitmores returned. She could pretend she had seen nothing, continue her life of comfortable servitude, and hope that when the truth finally came to light, she would be considered just another innocent victim of her employer's deception. But as she watched Marcus work, she thought about her own daughter, Sophia, who was studying pre-med at a community college, with dreams of becoming a doctor who could serve their neighborhood. How many Sophias had been denied the chance to save lives because medications were kept from their communities? How many families had buried children who could have been saved, if not for the calculated cruelty of men like Richard Whitmore? The storm began to subside, and Marcus seemed to sense that his time was running short. He carefully returned everything to its original position, leaving no trace of his presence except for the hidden recording devices that would serve as silent witnesses to future crimes. As he prepared to leave, he paused once more before Richard's portrait, and this time Maria could see his lips moving in what appeared to be a promise, or perhaps a prayer. When Marcus finally left the study, Maria retreated deeper into the shadows, her heart pounding as she listened to his footsteps cross the foyer. But instead of leaving immediately, he stopped. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, and Maria began to fear that he had somehow detected her presence. Then she heard his voice, soft but clear, speaking into what must have been a phone. "It's done. The evidence is secured, and the recording devices are in place. When they return, we'll have everything we need to bring them down." There was a pause, and then he continued, "No, I don't feel guilty about destroying him. He stopped being my father the day he chose his reputation over his own child." The front door closed with a finality that seemed to echo through Maria's soul. She stood in the darkness for a long time, processing what she had witnessed and understanding that her life had just been divided into before and after this moment. The comfortable certainty of her existence had been replaced by a terrible knowledge that demanded action. Over the next 3 days, as the storm cleared and the Whitmores prepared to return from their extended vacation, Maria found herself unable to perform her duties with the same mindless efficiency that had characterized her 8 years of service. Every surface she cleaned seemed to whisper accusations. Every family photograph mocked her with its facade of respectability. She began to notice things she had previously overlooked or dismissed. The way Richard's study was always locked, even when he was home. The hushed phone conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. The medical journals scattered throughout the house, filled with research about diseases that disproportionately affected poor communities. The charity events that raised money for causes that never seemed to receive the promised donations. When the Whitmores finally returned, Maria watched them with new eyes. Richard's jovial greeting felt hollow, his smile a mask that barely concealed the monster underneath. Eleanor's complaints about the house's condition during their absence seemed petty and cruel when measured against the suffering her family had caused. Bradley's casual racism, previously dismissed as youthful ignorance, now revealed itself as inherited evil being passed to the next generation. But it was during Richard's first business call in his study that Maria's world truly shifted. Hidden in the adjacent hallway, she listened as he discussed the African problem with someone on the other end of the line. They were planning to introduce a new medication for malaria, but only after ensuring that existing treatments became unavailable in sub-Saharan Africa, creating a captive market for their more expensive alternative. The casual way Richard discussed the deaths that would result from this strategy made Maria's stomach turn. These weren't numbers on a spreadsheet to him. They were acceptable losses in his pursuit of greater profits. As she listened to him laugh about the natural selection that would occur when people couldn't afford his company's medications, Maria realized that Marcus's quest for justice wasn't just personal, it was a moral imperative. That night, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She began documenting her own observations, writing down conversations she had overheard, photographing documents that were left carelessly on Richard's desk, and recording the casual cruelty that filled this house like poison gas. If Marcus was building a case against his father, she would help him, not as a servant seeking revenge, but as a human being who could no longer remain silent in the face of systematic evil. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. Richard was hosting a dinner party for several pharmaceutical executives and government officials, the kind of gathering where real business was conducted away from public scrutiny. Maria was expected to serve drinks and remain invisible, a role she had perfected over 8 years of practice. But this time, she carried a small recording device that Marcus had somehow managed to slip to her during a brief encounter at the local market. He had approached her while she was buying groceries, his presence both surprising and somehow inevitable. "I know you saw me," he had said quietly, his eyes holding a mixture of hope and desperation. "And I know you understand what's at stake." The conversation that followed had been brief but transformative. Marcus wasn't just seeking revenge against the father who had abandoned him. He was trying to save lives. The evidence he was gathering would be turned over to federal investigators, international human rights organizations, and journalists who specialized in exposing corporate corruption. But he needed inside access, someone who could document the ongoing crimes that were being planned in Richard's study. "I can't ask you to risk your job," Marcus had said, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was requesting, "but I can tell you that if we don't stop them, thousands more people will die. Children who could be saved, families who could be kept together, communities that could thrive instead of merely surviving." Maria had looked into his eyes and seen her own father, who had died from a treatable illness because he couldn't afford the medication that could have saved him. She had seen her neighbors, who rationed insulin and blood pressure medications because pharmaceutical companies had priced them out of reach. She had seen her own daughter's future and understood that it would be shaped by the choices made in rooms like Richard's study. The dinner party proceeded exactly as Maria had expected. Powerful men in expensive suits discussed human suffering with the same casual indifference they might show when choosing wine. They spoke of market optimization and profit maximization, while planning strategies that would result in preventable deaths across the developing world. But what Maria recorded that night went beyond even her worst expectations. Richard and his associates weren't just withholding medications, they were actively sabotaging relief efforts, bribing officials to reject generic alternatives, and funding research designed to create dependency rather than cures. They discussed the business model of suffering with the enthusiasm of children planning a game. The most chilling moment came when one of the guests, a government official whose name Maria recognized from news reports about healthcare policy, raised his glass in a toast. "To the beautiful irony of healing the sick," he said with a laugh that made Maria's skin crawl. "The sicker they are, the more they need us. The more they need us, the more they'll pay. And if they can't pay, well, that's just natural selection at work." The laughter that followed this toast would haunt Maria's dreams for years to come. These weren't monsters hiding in the shadows. They were respected members of society, philanthropists who attended charity galas, and politicians who spoke about healthcare as a human right. Their evil was normalized, institutionalized, and protected by systems that valued profit over human life. As the evening progressed, Maria began to understand the full scope of what Marcus was attempting. This wasn't just about exposing one corrupt company. It was about revealing a network of complicity that reached into the highest levels of government and industry. The evidence she was gathering would help bring down an entire system of legalized murder. When the last guest finally left, Maria retreated to her room with the weight of terrible knowledge pressing against her chest. She had recorded enough evidence to destroy Richard Whitmore and everyone who had attended his dinner party. But she also understood that releasing this information would make her a target for people with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. The next morning brought a development that changed everything once again. Marcus appeared at the kitchen door just after dawn, his usually composed demeanor cracked with urgency and fear. "They know," he said without preamble. "Someone tipped them off. Richard knows that evidence has been gathered, and he's planning to destroy everything and disappear." Maria's blood turned to ice as she processed this information. If Richard was planning to run, he would also be planning to eliminate any witnesses who could connect him to his crimes. She thought of Sophia, safely away at college, and felt a mixture of relief and terror. Her daughter would be safe, but Maria herself was now in mortal danger. "There's something else," Marcus continued, his voice heavy with a pain that went beyond fear. "I found out why he abandoned me. It wasn't just about protecting his reputation. My mother was investigating Whitmore Pharmaceuticals when she met him. She was a journalist working on a story about medication shortages in urban communities. He seduced her to get close to her research, and when she became pregnant, he saw an opportunity to control her." The revelation hit Maria like a physical blow. Marcus's mother hadn't been just another conquest. She had been a threat that Richard had neutralized through manipulation and abandonment. When she died in what was officially ruled a car accident, she had taken her research with her, and Richard had raised their son in poverty while building his fortune on the suffering of people just like them. "But she was smarter than he realized," Marcus continued, pulling out a safety deposit box key. "She left everything to me, all her research, all her evidence, and a letter explaining how she had been betrayed. I've spent 15 years building on her work, gathering evidence, and preparing for this moment." Maria understood now why Marcus moved with such confidence and purpose. This wasn't just personal revenge, it was the completion of his mother's mission, a quest for justice that had been passed from one generation to the next. And now, through circumstances that felt almost like destiny, Maria had become part of that mission. The sound of cars in the driveway interrupted their conversation. Richard was returning early from his morning golf game, and he wasn't alone. Through the kitchen window, Maria could see black SUVs with tinted windows, the kind of vehicles that suggested serious money and dangerous intentions. Marcus grabbed Maria's hand with surprising gentleness. "I'm sorry I brought this into your life," he said, his eyes reflecting a pain that went beyond the immediate danger. "But I need you to know that what we're doing matters. The evidence we've gathered will save lives, even if it costs us our own." Maria looked into his eyes and saw her father, her daughter, and all the people who had suffered because of men like Richard Whitmore. She thought about the comfortable servitude she was about to lose and the dangerous freedom she was about to gain. The choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really a choice at all. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Marcus smiled for the first time since she had met him, and in that smile, Maria saw hope. "We finish what my mother started," he said. "We make sure the truth comes to light, no matter what it costs us." The front door slammed open with a violence that shook the entire house. Richard's voice, raised in anger and fear, echoed through the halls as he shouted orders to the men who had accompanied him. They were searching for something or someone, and Maria realized that her 8 years of invisibility were about to come to an abrupt end. But as she listened to the chaos erupting around them, Maria felt something unexpected: peace. For the first time in her adult life, she was on the right side of a fight that mattered. She was no longer just a witness to evil. She was actively working to stop it. The comfortable certainty of her old life was gone, but it had been replaced by something far more valuable: purpose. Marcus pulled out his phone and began uploading the evidence they had gathered to multiple secure servers around the world. "Oh, whatever happens next," he said as the sound of footsteps grew closer, "they can't stop the truth from coming out. Too many people have copies now. Too many journalists are already investigating. The story is bigger than any of us." The kitchen door burst open, and Richard Whitmore stood in the doorway like a demon, materialized from Maria's worst nightmares. But when he saw Marcus, his face went through a transformation that revealed the true depth of his evil. The mask of respectability fell away completely, replaced by a rage so pure and consuming that it seemed to fill the room like smoke. "You," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of 35 years of denial and hatred. "And I should have killed you when you were born." Marcus stood slowly, his composure intact despite the mortal danger that now surrounded them. "Hello, Father," he said with a calm that seemed to infuriate Richard even more. "I've been looking forward to this conversation for a very long time." What followed was a confrontation that stripped away decades of lies and revealed the true nature of both men. Richard's attempts to justify his actions, to claim that his abandonment of Marcus had been motivated by anything other than pure selfishness, crumbled under the weight of evidence that Marcus had spent years accumulating. But it was Maria who delivered the final blow. As Richard raged about betrayal and ingratitude, she stepped forward with the recording device that had captured his dinner party conversations. "I heard what you said about natural selection," she said, her voice cutting through his fury like a blade. "I heard you laugh about children dying because they couldn't afford your medications." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stared at Maria as if seeing her for the first time, his mind struggling to process the fact that his invisible servant had become the instrument of his destruction. The men who had accompanied him shifted uncomfortably, perhaps beginning to understand that they had been brought here to witness something that could destroy them all. Marcus used the moment of stunned silence to reveal the full scope of what he had accomplished. The evidence wasn't just gathered, it was already being broadcast. News organizations around the world were simultaneously releasing stories about Whitmore Pharmaceuticals and the network of corruption that had enabled their crimes. Government agencies were already moving to freeze assets and issue arrest warrants. "It's over," Marcus said simply. "All of it, the company, the network, the system that allowed you to profit from human suffering. My mother's work is finally complete." Richard's response was predictable but still shocking in its intensity. He lunged forward with a violence that spoke of a man who had nothing left to lose, but Marcus was ready for him. The struggle that followed was brief but decisive, ending with Richard on the floor and his hired men backing away from a situation that had clearly spiraled beyond their ability to control. As sirens began to wail in the distance, Maria felt a strange sense of completion. The comfortable prison of her old life was gone forever, but in its place was something she had never dared to hope for. The knowledge that she had helped bring justice to people who had suffered in silence for too long. The months that followed brought trials and revelations that dominated international headlines. Whitmore Pharmaceuticals was dismantled, its assets liquidated to provide compensation for the communities that had been harmed by its policies. Richard and his associates faced justice in courts around the world, their comfortable lives replaced by the harsh reality of consequences for their actions. But perhaps, most importantly, the evidence that Marcus and Maria had gathered led to systemic changes in how pharmaceutical companies were regulated and monitored. New laws were passed to prevent the kind of artificial shortages and price manipulation that had cost so many lives. International oversight committees were established to ensure that life-saving medications reached the people who needed them most. Maria's life changed in ways she could never have imagined. The testimony she provided during the trials made her a key witness in one of the most important human rights cases of the decade. The courage she had shown in documenting Richard's crimes earned her recognition from organizations around the world that fought for social justice. More importantly, her actions had secured a future for her daughter that would have been impossible under the old system. Sophia graduated from medical school with the help of a scholarship funded by the liquidated assets of Whitmore Pharmaceuticals, and she now works in community clinics that provide free healthcare to underserved populations. Marcus used his inheritance from his father's destroyed empire to establish a foundation that monitors pharmaceutical companies and advocates for patients' rights. He and Maria remained close friends, bound together by the shared experience of choosing justice over comfort, truth over safety. The Whitmore mansion was eventually converted into a community health center, its opulent rooms transformed into examination areas and treatment facilities. Maria sometimes visits, not as a servant, but as a board member of the foundation that operates the facility. Walking through those halls where she once cleaned in silence, she marvels at how completely the purpose of the space has been transformed. The portrait of Richard Whitmore no longer dominates the foyer. In its place hangs a memorial to all the people who died because of his greed, their names etched in stone as a reminder that every life has value and every death matters. Below the memorial is a simple plaque that reads, "In memory of those who suffered in silence, and in honor of those who found the courage to speak." Standing before that memorial, Maria often thinks about the night that changed everything. The storm that brought Marcus to his father's house had been more than just weather. It had been a cleansing force that washed away decades of lies and revealed the truth that had been hidden in the shadows. If this story has shown you anything, it's that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they choose to act on their principles rather than their fears. Share this message with someone who needs to remember that their voice matters, that their actions can change the world, and that justice delayed is not always justice denied. The rain still falls sometimes on the building that was once the Whitmore mansion, but now it nourishes the gardens where children play while their parents receive the medical care that was once denied to them. The sound of laughter has replaced the whispers of conspiracy, and hope has taken root where despair once flourished. Maria's story reminds us that heroism doesn't always come in dramatic gestures or grand proclamations. Sometimes it comes in the quiet decision to document injustice, to speak truth to power, and to stand with those who fight for what's right, even when the cost seems too high to bear. In a world where evil often hides behind respectability and power, it's the invisible people who see the most. And sometimes it's their courage that changes everything.